The committee will adjourn as soon as the division bells are rung and resume after 10 minutes. Motion for debate, Built Environment Committee report, public transport in towns and cities. Lord Moylan.
My Lords, in rising to propose this motion, may I start by paying tribute to my predecessor as chairman of the committee, my noble friend Lady Neville Rofe, who in fact chaired the committee during almost the entire period when evidence was being taken that resulted in this report. And so any credit due to the chairing skills involved in producing it must accrue to her and not to me. May I also put on record the committee's thanks to its specialist advisor, Dr. Simon Blaney, and also to its clerk at the time, Dee Goddard, and her team. Dee left the service of the House shortly afterwards in order to relocate with her family to Yorkshire. But she was wonderful, and her whole team were wonderful in supporting us as we did our work. It's also very good today, if I may say, to see so many current and former members of the committee present and participating in this debate. I'm not proposing in these introductory remarks to give a comprehensive account of everything that the report says, partly because it would take too long, and partly because it would leave very little for other members of the committee to say when they came to speak. But we were all agreed on the importance of public transport in our towns and cities. The government gave a pledge when it was elected to bring public transport in towns and cities up to the standards that exist in London. Now, we understand that is difficult because London has a large amount of inherited infrastructure, particularly rail, underground infrastructure, and a large concentration of people. But we wanted, in preparing this report, to see how the government was doing. The brief answer is not terribly well, but a large amount of that can be explained, I think, by the effects of the pandemic, and in particular by a fall in demand an understandable fall during the pandemic in demand for public transport services, which has been sustained, not entirely, but to some extent, so that demand is lower now than it was before. And it looks as though that might continue to be the case for some time, nobody knows, but it presents a conundrum and a difficulty for the government. And so let me come straight away to my remarks on one of the two topics I'd like to focus on, which is buses. Buses provide 2/3 of public transport trips throughout the country, and they're vital in all of our towns and cities. We know that passenger numbers grow if bus operators offer what is referred to in the business as a turn-up-and-go service. That is, a service at sufficient frequency, about 10 minutes interval, so that passengers don't have to consult a timetable before they leave home or decide to catch the bus, but are confident that if they turn up at any particular time, they won't have to wait too long. After all, a 10-minute interval means an average wait of 5 minutes for anyone who is regularly using a service. So a turn-up-and-go service attracts passengers. Yet the effect of a falling demand, passenger demand, has been in fact a reduction in services. Now I want to congratulate the government on maintaining its support for the bus network that it provided during the pandemic and has continued to provide at a certain level since, because we identified the fact that if that support did not continue beyond the end of March this year, and it was at the time that we were writing the report due to end in March this year, then we were predicting a fall in services of 20%. The government did continue its funding, and that fall of 20% hasn't actually occurred. But even so, newspaper reports tell us that there has been a fall of 10% in bus passenger services, and that is probably, in a sense, the new normal. Now, I do think that we deserve as a country to have a serious discussion about buses. And here I want to refer to, with some admiration, to Ken Livingstone when he was Mayor of London, because he illustrates an approach that did work. And his approach was to bus services, up until the point in which he'd become mayor, had been in a state of decline in London, and demand had been falling and services were not reliable. And he succeeded in ramping up provisions so that most buses were operating on a turn-up-and-go service, and demand rocketed and has been sustained, not recently as the pandemic, but was sustained at that level. But it came with a very serious cost, because the subsidy, that is, the cost, the difference between the fare income and the cost of operating the service, grew very substantially. In his time, it was well on the way to £500 million a year. It's now considerably in excess of that. And I think a large part of that was to do with the fact that the fares were set lower than they needed to have been set. So there is a trade-off here, in my view, between providing the sort of service that attracts passengers and a willingness to set fares in a way that makes the subsidy manageable financially, which is obviously a consideration for the government. There's also, and this is a very sensitive subject, the question of concessions. In London, it was the case that approximately 40% of passengers were not paying a fare. There are, of course, statutory concessions that exist for bus passengers, the Freedom Pass in London, the National Bus scheme, passenger scheme for elderly people, but they're targeted largely at elderly people. There have been a large number of voluntary and discretionary concessions granted that could be removed without actually amending statute. So I think at some point, and maybe today is the point at which to kick it off, it is worth having a serious debate about how we are going to respond to this fall in demand. Is it by cutting services, which in my view leads to a spiral of decline? Is it by trying to ramp up services but controlling the subsidy, as I'm calling it, by a combination of fares and more limited concessions? These are hard topics to face, but I think they're serious ones if we're going to look forward and discuss buses in public transport, and buses in particular, in towns and cities in the coming decade. The second subject I wanted to concentrate on was one where the committee was led down some paths of inquiry it hadn't particularly expected to follow. And that is to do with the restrictions being imposed on the use of private motor vehicles in towns and cities. Because while demand from passengers for public transport has fallen, demand from local authorities for new public transport infrastructure has been rising. Now, to some extent, this has been encouraged by the government making funding available, and I'll just step out of my main stream of thought for a moment to say that one of the issues that the committee raised was whether the funding system was fit for purpose. In other words, whether bidding for government money in a competitive environment produced the best outcomes. Was it the case, the committee thought it might be the case, that bidding processes actually reward local authorities which are large and good at bidding, rather than local authorities which had fundamentally a good case for new transport provision? And that's a point the Minister may want to comment on. But where does this demand for new investment, new infrastructure come from? And it appeared when talking, as we did, in various places we visited, to highways engineers and local authorities, local councillors, that a lot of it was coming from the fact that they had set targets for the reduction in the number of vehicle trips in towns and cities, and they wanted the money not only to build the public realm in a more pedestrian-friendly fashion, but also for the transport infrastructure that would substitute for people using their cars. And a target of 20% or 30% is found almost universally. Now, the Minister, when we quizzed her about this, said that this was not a government target and not a national target. It's entirely a local matter. But how is it that all the localities tend to come to the same number? We started to inquire into this. And of course, those of us with experience of local government know that a lot of development takes place, policy development takes place on the basis of what academics in their field are saying and what the professional bodies that represent that particular branch of local authority officers are disseminating. And what we discovered is that the academic world was pushing strongly for this 20%, 30% reduction, partly as a basis of interim targets, on the basis of meeting non-statutory interim targets for net zero, partly on the basis of the fact that if all the vehicles become electric, and of course if they all do become electric, then the pollution, the air quality problems largely dissipate. That if all the vehicles became electric, we wouldn't have enough electricity to run them. So the vision that these people have is of towns and cities with much more public transport, much larger limitations on car use, and limitations, in fact, on car ownership because the electricity simply won't be available to run them. But there's been no real discussion about this. Now, the Minister's point that this was not a national policy, which I obviously accept in good faith, was controverted for me when I had my attention drawn only a matter of days ago to the newly published 2030 vision of the Driver Vehicle and Standards Agency, which is, of course, a national body that reports to the Department for Transport and thus to my noble friend. And if one looks at page 11, one sees that part of their vision for 2030 is that by half of all journeys in towns and cities will be made by walking and cycling. So I think it does make it slightly more difficult for the government to say that they don't have a national policy on this if one of their executive agencies so clearly does. And I think it needs to be flushed out and discussed. Does it command the support that that policymakers think it might? And if it does, why are they so reluctant to discuss it in public? Some honesty on this and openness, I think, would be really very helpful. Now, I won't go on very much longer, but I will just say that other topics we discussed were post-project evaluation, which we thought needed to be undertaken much more seriously and in a much more determined way. And in the reply we had from the Minister, this was the subject on which we detected the most stickiness and defensiveness on the part of the department. That they're really not very keen on post-project evaluation. And we will continue, I think, to press on that. And finally, I'd say we had a number of recommendations that I could summarize as how do you make public transport more user-friendly? Thinking about it from the perspective of the passenger. Things to do with ticketing and with timetable, with better information, with more integration of services. These are things on which we think the government needs to take. These are things we think the government needs to take in hand. And of course, the rather fractured local system we have, with local authorities being required either to adopt an enhanced partnership or a franchising model with local bus providers, can make that more difficult. But with that, my lords, I shall bring my opening remarks to an end, and I beg to move.
The question is that this motion be agreed to.